Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little. I want to thank you for being here with me today. We are going to be going through high stakes online final tables featuring some of the best players in the world. I had many final tables to choose from, and I picked these because they have some of the best players in the world, and a lot of them getting in there battling and fighting hard for the win. Sometimes they fight very hard, sometimes they play rather cautiously, and that's the difficult thing to know how to do, right? So, well, let's review these final tables. These are all from very high stakes online tournaments. I picked these final tables based on the presence of world-class players who I respect. I am very well in tuned and locked in with the high stakes poker world, and I know who the best players in the world are, at least in my opinion. And I think my opinion is very valid here. And I picked final tables featuring those players to go over because I am trying to learn from this as well. So these the play at these final tables is very similar to what you will encounter if you're playing against strong opponents. I understand weaker opponents may not be doing quite as many things, but fortunately at every single one of these final tables, there was a weaker player or two who's making kind of absurd plays. Like in one, someone raised under the gun and a guy just like calls in the cutoff with queen four suited. Not a good play, right? And we point that out. And you'll see even more plays like that in small stakes and medium stakes tournaments or when you're playing against bad players in general. And that's just great, right? I mean, as your opponents play worse, they're just handing you their money. So be happy when they play like that. And it's easy to play against players who play way too many hands because they're going to have way too much junk. And when they have too much junk, you just don't fold good hands. So many of these players that we do review are the best in the world. I made a point to review a game with the number 1 and the number 2 player in the world, according to the online rankings. So whatever they do is almost certainly optimal. It's almost certainly correct. Okay? So it's correct based on the reads, the knowledge that they have. So understand that some of these players may be making plays that may not initially look intuitive. And that is often because they have stats on their opponents and they are making reads. Remember, these are the best players in the world. They are not playing like a perfect computer. They're playing like a perfect computer that adjusts to their opponent's tendencies. So if we see them doing anything that's really bizarre, then most likely it's a factor of them taking advantage of something they think their opponent does wrong. And realize that as observers, we're not going to be fully aware of all these dynamics, but we are going to do our absolute best. So that's it. I'm ready to get to the games. I hope you all enjoy this series. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you do too. Good luck in your games, and I'll talk to you later. All right, here we have the final table of a $2,000 buy-in Sunday high roller event. Let's go ahead and go around the table and introduce the players. We have Ape Styles, who is John Van Fleet. I personally learned a lot from his training content. He teaches the people at the Poker Backing Company a bit, and I've learned a lot from it. Next we have Agro Santos, very good player, Scott Mergerson, something like that. Sorry, I'm going to butcher some of these names because I am a silly American. Next we have Lena 900, who is a guy named Nicholas Asted, I believe is how you say his name. He is the #1 ranked player in the world, so certainly someone you want to be paying attention to. I don't know who Compers is. Hello Toddy. I also don't know who that is, but number 5 ranked in the world. So we have number 1 and number 5. So 2 very good high-stakes regulars. Next, we have I'm Luckbox. I'm sorry, this is not I'm Luckbox. Who is this? This is European. Sorry, European. This is Samuel Vosden, I believe. That's how you say the name. And very good player, ranked very highly as well. I think currently number 45, but in the past, like number 1, 2, or 3, something like that. Next, I'm Luckbox, who is Michael Adamo. I have played a decent amount with him live, and he's a very tough player. He has something like 5 million in live cashes and a bunch online too. And Watt Los, I do not know who that is, and also this player here at the bottom, CS, I do not know who that is as well. So let's take a look at what we are playing. We are playing 4,000, 8,000, okay? So looking around the table, we have 1 shallow stack with 15 big blinds. Then everyone else has more, something like 30 big blinds or more, although I guess we do have about 30 big blinds or more throughout. So we're going to go through this. I may speed up the content a little bit if it goes relatively slow. By the way, all that information was found just through Googling, so no information, and it's very sensitive there, right? Like, I'm sure some people know who Hello Toddy is, for example, and it's not on the internet. So you don't want to spoil that kind of thing if you do know who it is. All right, easy raise from ace-4. Interesting call from European. I'm kind of surprised he did not 3-bet this hand that is obviously very strong. Especially as the chip leader, this is a spot where you would think you could just 3-bet and then be happy getting it in, but he does not. Hopefully the internet cooperates. I guess we'll see. So this is a spot where Hello Toddy can either check or bet small, I imagine. It's probably fine just to check because it's pretty easy for European to have a lot of big cards when he calls small blind, like he does, right? And a lot of those big cards line up very well with ace-jack. So there's no purpose in European betting at all here. He's just going to check down. If he checks down, he's going to win a lot of the time. And the ace-4 kind of has to assume that as well. So there's no point for the ace-4 to bet either because ace-4 beats king-queen, beats queen-10, and it beats some random calls with stuff like 8-7 that's deciding to give up. And like we see here, European has no reason to bet whatsoever. Should the ace-4 bluff? Well, is a better hand going to fold? Probably not, right? So there's no purpose in the ace-4 betting. So 2 solidly played hands right there. Nothing too fancy, but you're going to find that good, fundamentally sound poker is very often not the most fancy poker. It's going to be a spot where European's definitely going to open. Notice he makes it a little bit more than a min raise. I think this is good. I think you're going to generally find that if you make it a little bit more than a min raise, you get a little bit more fold equity, especially in live poker, where people see a min raise and they think, oh, a minimum raise, I have to call. But in online poker, people are starting to realize, okay, you need to call a lot. One thing you will notice all the good players are doing is they're using very small continuation bets. Their European bet 20% pot. That's something that is just a good strategy because it's very difficult for the opponent to defend properly. When European turns this draw, I imagine he's just going to keep betting because he has no showdown value, right? If he does not bet this turn, he's obviously going to bet the river. And as you see now, he does bet using a relatively large sizing. And this is going to put all of Watt's marginal made hands in a pretty rough spot. So now, does he try on the river? He probably should, right? He has no showdown value. He loses to every made hand. It's very easy for Watt to have any pair. And any pair is going to be put in a bad spot against a river bet. But he decides not to do it. I'm kind of surprised he didn't decide to go for it there. He probably assumed that if he's going for it in that spot, he's just going for it with way too many hands. But I think at a final table where there is a short stack, that's probably just fine, especially if the opponent plays well. And in that scenario, I understand that it's easy for Watt just to be check calling with a king and never folding, or even check calling with a flush. But I'm kind of surprised he didn't go for it. All right. One thing you will find a lot of good players doing is flat calling in the cutoff or the button, facing middle and early position raises. Especially if they know the initial raiser is a little bit loose, and right here, Ape Styles is a little bit on the loose side. Everyone has nothing. I don't expect anyone to really take a stab at this pot. It's just too easy for someone to have something. Maybe on the river, Watt or European decides to bluff. Ape Styles has no reason to bluff at all, because he has the best hand a lot of the time if it checks down. But probably no one's going to do anything here. It's pretty easy for both Watt and Ape Styles to be checking with a heart, like 10 of hearts, queen of hearts, jack of hearts, etc. So I'm not sure if European should even try to bluff here. It's a pretty rough spot because, yes, you're going to lose basically every time, but it's just so easy for someone to have a flush. It's obviously not going to fold, right? The thing about playing against good players is that they are going to be checking with a lot of their very clear marginal made hands, right? Which is exactly what I teach over at pokercoaching.com. Make sure you go there and get your free trial if you have not yet. And it makes it really difficult for you to play. I'm kind of surprised there that CS didn't jam the Jack-8 suited over the button raise of Watt. Watt's been involved in a few pots so far, and he just couldn't beat ace-9 on that board, so maybe, in my mind, people would think he's opening a little bit too loose. Of course, I'm sure these players have better stats than I do, because we have none. But I'm kind of surprised that CS didn't jam that Jack-8 suited as the shallow stack. If there were other shallow stacks at the table, I certainly would understand the idea of folding. But as the only shallow stack, I think you need to be getting after it a little bit. So you have a raise and 3-bet. I imagine I would just fold here if I was European. Queen Jack offsuit is not a good hand to be calling 3-bets with because you're going to be quite dominated by any reasonable 3-betting range. So you just need to get out of the way, as he does. If you're facing a small 3-bet, I mean, it becomes way rougher, way more difficult. But even then, I think it's fine just to fold. You should pretty much always fold. Queen Jack is not a good hand. If it's suited, then sure. All right, CS can either jam or min raise. At a final table, in general, you don't really mind just picking up the blinds when you're playing 10 or 12 big blinds deep. So you will see a lot of the best players just open jamming in these scenarios. And that is what he does. You have to understand, whenever you just open jam, you win the pot, which is 2.5 big blinds, right? Roughly. So if you win 2.5 big blinds, that's a lot. Whenever you only have 10. Basically, you're adding 25% to your stack with no variance whatsoever because your opponents don't get to realize any of their equity. And usually that's just a great result. So this is probably going to end up being a walk. I do know a lot of players online are limping from the small blind with like any 2 cards in non-final table scenarios. But at the final table, or when there are big payout jumps, you really do want to not play a lot of junk from out of position. Especially when you're playing relatively shallow stacked, or any one misstep could be detrimental. So you're probably going to find more folds in those scenarios. All right, Compers can either call or 3-bet against Watt. I typically just call here, especially facing a 2.5 big blind raise. It's a little bit odd. He does just call. He's probably going to call this flop. As you see, again, another very small bet, right? This is something you don't see in live poker. And it's a mistake that almost everyone makes. A lot of people bet way too big. And if you study the high roller tournaments, you're going to find that all the good players are using small sizings. And the reason those are so good is because they make it difficult for your opponent to defend at the correct frequency. And that's quite powerful, right? The idea that your opponent needs to call like 80% of their hands, but they're only going to call with 50% of them, so you're just printing equity every time they fold. All right, so here on the turn, Watt went for a check shove all in, which is kind of interesting. I'm surprised he just didn't bet. Check shoving is quite nice because it lets you have some fold equity with some draws. And it does give you fold equity so that your opponent doesn't get to realize their equity with the draws that they could have. Now, should Compers have bet the turn? And I would venture to say probably not. Because think about this, right? Watt is going to check call with a lot of marginal made hands like the kings, like the tens, right? Like pocket jacks, etc. And so what is he going to fold? I think he's going to fold out a lot of the garbage. So I really don't like this turn bet by Compers. Again, I don't know the 3 players I did not know. Compers, Watt, and CS. I don't know if they're good players or bad players. I just had a hard time finding anything definitive on them. So I don't know if they're good or bad, but this is a $2,000 buy in high roller tournament, so presumably they're pretty good, right? Anyway, I don't really like this bet. I don't think it's necessary. Yeah, you maybe get a hand like pocket 5s to fold, but that's it. And now if he has to fold once check shoved. I don't mind the check shove there. I think that's pretty nice. It's a good way to get the whole stack in immediately. Yes, you're just out every time you have the worst hand, but clearly you're going to lose all your money with aces anyway. So that's fine. King Jack for Alina. Let's see if he opens it up. It's definitely a marginal spot with the stack size. I'm sorry, we have a raise. I completely missed it. It's a spot where if they did fold around to King Jack, opening it is fine, but probably not ideal against 2 very good players in the big blind when there are a bunch of 20 and 30 big blind stacks hanging around. I don't know the exact payouts for this tournament, but it doesn't really matter. What really matters is, are they normal? And yes, the payouts are relatively normal in this tournament. So don't think you're supposed to make any sort of insane play in bubble scenarios. A7 suited under the gun fold for ape styles, which I think is good and fine. One thing you will definitely notice as well is that good players just don't play bad cards unless they're in late position or in the big blind, right? A lot of recreational players think they're supposed to play all sorts of junk seemingly randomly, and you're just not. Notice there, Queen 5 fold. I think that's fine. Multi-way, you have to assume the raiser has something, and the caller, especially from the small blind, must have something too. So Queen 5 is going to be quite dominated. So easy fold there, even getting good pot odds. Notice there, I'm Luckbox used a 33% pot bet on this board. Typically, as the board is more coordinated, you're going to want to use a slightly bigger sizing, just because that's going to give your opponents worse odds with their draws, and you don't really care if they fold out gut shots, right? And if they call a gut shots, like this King 10, you want to make sure you charge them a little bit. So, notice a big bet on the turn. As the board gets more and more draw heavy, you need to size up your bets. So you're going to find very often the optimal strategy is to bet something relatively small on the flop and then use a bigger sizing on the turn. And that's what happened. This King-Queen suited could min-raise, could even conceivably open jam. I would not open jam here because there are shallow stacks as well. I think this pocket fours should probably just be a fold. Pocket fours is not a great hand to flat with, given the initial raiser only has 200k, right? And Ape Styles just rips it in. It's a big shove over Watt, but again, Watt probably doesn't have anything too great, because if Watt did have something great, he would probably have re-raised, right? I suppose he could have aces, but even then Ape Styles has ace and king blocker to make it hard for the opponent to have aces, exactly, right? So you could conceivably defend the 9-6 offsuit, but again, in final table scenarios, it's usually fine to be a little bit tighter. You definitely don't have to defend any two cards, especially against Under the Gun, right? Because Under the Gun should have quite a strong range. Nine-8 suited open from Europeans, very fine and standard. Everybody's probably going to fold, although Lena may decide to defend, getting good odds, but again, notice a pretty rough hand decides to not continue, and that's fine. Ace-9 suited. It's definitely a hand you could conceivably open. King-Jack here for CS, I think, is just going to be a fold. The only time you could possibly jam here is if you are just like really, really sure I'm Luckbox has a good hand, and quite often that's not going to be quite often that will be the case when they're opening from early to middle position. Queen 10 suited is easy to defend. So now Ace-9 has to be a little bit cautious betting here because the opponent's going to have a lot of equity on this board, usually with either a pair or a gut shot or something like that. So I think this is probably supposed to just be a check for I'm Luckbox, with the idea of checking down. Because when you bet and get called, you're never really happy. Whereas if it just gets checked down, you're not so unhappy. So I'm not sure I like that bet. But notice he did use a small bet, right? If you are, in scenarios like this, if you are going to bet small, betting minimum is usually perfectly good and perfectly fine, because then if they fold out any hand with any equity, it's just a fine result. Now that he did pick up the draw, he decides to bet again, and I'm kind of surprised that he's betting in these scenarios, because it's quite easy for Compress to have either just a pair that's not going to fold, and the ace-high does win every once in a while. Maybe he realizes this is one of the worst hands in his range to bet the flop and bet the turn, and maybe that's the case. Certainly could be the case. Maybe he's wanting to value bet with all sorts of hands, like any jack, any 10, any 8. So in that case, maybe he doesn't have very many bluffs in his range. Now on the river, it's a pretty rough spot to be in for Compress whenever the queen comes in, because ace-king gets there, any 9 gets there. You were already losing to an 8. So I like the river fold. I think Compress played it fine. Fine and good. I'm kind of surprised I'm Luckbox went for it there, though. No, it's just an open jam here. It's a pretty tough spot for Compress now with ace-jack. CS hasn't been too aggressive so far, so you could conceivably fold. I guess he did open jam 12 big blinds earlier, so maybe you're thinking he's jamming a little bit too wide. It's probably just going to be a fold in general, though. But he does not fold this time. The problem with hands like ace-jack, ace-10, ace-9 suited, king-queen, is that when your opponent's jamming from early to middle position, they usually have something pretty good. So what is pretty good? Well, ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, pairs, suited connector hands, right? And against that range, you're somewhere near 50-50. And you don't really want to be 50-50. You want to be ahead. Or here you have a raise and all in from the tiny, tiny stack, which is fine. And then call from both players, which is neat. I'm always a little bit cautious in these scenarios because Lena can just bet flop, bet turn, and jam river, and there's not a whole lot Hello Toddy can do in these scenarios if he has even like a one pair hand. So you have to be very, very cautious when there is someone all in for a very shallow stack, right? So I'm not going to say the king 10 suited should certainly fold, but it's a spot where you do need to be very cautious. More cautious than normal because you really don't want to go broke in this hand, especially if compers could just randomly win. So now Lena has to decide, do we just play for all of our money? And Lena decides yes. Definitely a tough spot for European when the opponent bets flop and bets turn. And European makes the nitty fold. It's probably a fine fold if you know your opponent's not bluffing all that often. And like I said, that's the spot where Lena now has to be careful because European can bust him, right? So for Lena to continue betting the turn, he must have something decent. So I don't mind it. Certainly a snug fold, but the dynamic certainly makes a lot of sense to fold in that scenario. Definitely going to be a defend from I'm Luckbox. And probably just a check fold. Notice this board, Queen, Queen 7 is very different than the Jack 8, 8 board just a second ago. On this board, it's way more difficult for I'm Luckbox to have anything, right? On Jack 8, 8, he could have the opponent could have all sorts of gut shots, flush draws, etc. On Queen 7, 7, there are no gut shots, right? Which means that your bet on the flop is going to have way more fold equity. All right, so 8 styles normally opens a little bit wide. Interesting flat from Hello Toddy. I think it's not something I would have done. I probably would have just folded, given the stack sizes, but maybe he thinks being in position he's going to realize his equity very well. 8 styles goes for the slow play, which I think is fine. I'm usually not a big fan of slow playing, but you always have to ask, can the opponents actually have anything? And on ace 10, 10, the answer is not really, right? So slow playing in that scenario is fine. Pretty rough spot for Hello Toddy here. You have to assume 8 styles is going to check some aces on the flop. So he could definitely have lots of aces. He could also just have total bluffs, like say at 8, 7 of hearts, maybe he decides to bluff it on the turn, but I like to fold in that scenario. Once the other 10 comes in. Some people get completely married to full houses thinking, oh my god, I have a full house, it's the nuts, and then they just put their whole stack in, and that is always a mistake. In the past, just no one could fold a full house. Now they realize that full house in that scenario is a bad bluff catcher, especially multi-way. So a bunch of junky hands in this scenario. In this situation as well, no one should get too out of line because notice 8 styles here has the big stack. If, let's say, I'm Luckbox had 500k and everybody else had something like 300 or 200, then I'm Luckbox could open decently wide. But in this scenario, because everyone's playing relatively deep, I'm Luckbox can't get too out of line, right? You always want to make sure you're thinking about stack sizes and asking yourself, do my opponents have an incentive to be really tight here? And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have an incentive to be really loose and aggressive, in which case you really don't want to get out of line. Notice that previous hand ace 10 offsuit, 8 styles 3.5x from the small blind. That's perfectly fine. You can either use a strategy of limping a lot or raising with a very polarized range for the most part. Notice there, Agro Santos, same thing. 4 big blinds from the small blind with a blocker hand. The bluffs you typically want to have are going to be King X, Queen X, Jack X offsuits. And you can limp all the suited hands because you can limp those and then call a raise very easily. I think a lot of people got spoiled with poker a long time ago because they saw really insane, loose, aggressive plays made almost randomly. And that is just not what good, fundamentally sound poker is. And learning from the best players in the world, which is what we are doing here, is highly valuable because you can learn what good players actually do in these scenarios. Notice here, check call from Hello Toddy. Again, number 5 player in the world. Check, check on the turn for Watt. Now Hello Toddy's going to bet the river, and it's not going to go well. Watt should definitely go all in on the river. There is no merit to calling in my mind. Yes, Hello Toddy could randomly have 6-5, but you're not so worried about that. Now, for Hello Toddy, what a rough spot to be in. Watt's probably not bluffing here very often at all. Watt could also just have like ace 5 suited or 6-5 suited that decided to give up on the turn. Could also have just a set of 4s or slow played sets on the turn. What bluffs are available? I mean, you have to think King Jack would consider betting the turn again. Same thing for a lot of the like Ace 5 or 6-5. Those might bluff the turn. When I say 6-5, I mean 6-5 suited, obviously. So here, Hello Toddy's getting amazing pot odds, right? He has to put in 90 to win, I don't know, 400, something like that. So is he good 20, 25% of the time? He decided he was and is out. So definitely a tough spot, but you have to be careful in those scenarios because some people bluff there a lot and some people almost never bluff there. There definitely is merit to the idea of it would be insane to bluff here because I'm getting such good pot odds. Therefore, if I bet big on the river like Hello Toddy did and you get jammed, you can easily fold, right? There's also merit too, though, of I'm getting amazing pot odds. I need to win 20% of the time, so I cannot fold. So definitely a tough spot to be in. So Lena can either check or bet small in this scenario. He decides to bet small, which is perfectly viable. There are a lot of gut shot draws either opponent could have. Also, lots of hands just containing a king or a jack that you don't really mind getting to fold. European does decide to stick around. You'll also notice a lot of check calling going on from hands that can win at the showdown that have some value. Lena's definitely going to check turn, and that is what happens. And now does European need to bluff this hand? It's probably one of the worst hands he can have, but it also has a little bit of showdown value. It beats Queen Jack and King. I guess it chops with King Jack. So I don't think you need to bluff this one. If you had Queen Jack, you should probably bluff. But with the King high, I think you do have a bit of showdown value. You have to be careful bluffing too often against good players because if you're bluffing too often, they're just going to crush you because they're going to call at the appropriate frequency. So you have to make sure you're not bluffing too much. And in that scenario, King Queen is probably a little bit too wide. And also you have to ask, what am I trying to get my opponent to fold? You're trying to get a good player to fold a pair on the river. It's kind of tough to do, right? All right, CS has Ace Queen, definitely a fine hand to open, and then bet flop. Uses a big bet on the flop. I don't know if that's necessary. I think a smaller bet would have done. In general, big card, little card is very good for the initial raiser, and in those scenarios, you often don't mind betting small with a lot of your range. So notice here, Watt's going for the slow play. CS could raise or check. I do a decent amount of checking in position with hands that I really don't want to get blown off of. And King Jack, I think, is definitely one of those. It goes check, check on flop, check, check on turn, bet river. Brutal for aces to win nothing in that scenario, but I don't mind the way it was played. I probably would have just bet the flop with the aces because it's kind of easy for the opponent to have something. Notice there, Watt also went very fast with that hand and with the set on the river earlier, so maybe there's a bit of timing tell there. Timing tells certainly do exist, especially online. That's the only thing you really have to go off of besides bet sizing tells, but most people don't have those. So definitely an interesting spot. All right, we have small blind limp with King 5 suited. Remember how people will raise stuff like King 6 offsuit because it doesn't flop quite as well, but with the suited variety, you should be more inclined to raise, more inclined to limp because you can limp and then call a raise. Terrible river for CS. So does Ape Styles jam or bet small? He's trying to get called by a king or what? A 6 maybe? I think you have to jam. In this scenario, if you bet small, you're probably not going to get called a whole lot more often than if you bet big. And whenever you're deciding between a 50K sizing and a 150K sizing, you need the 50K sizing to get called 3 times as often as the 150K sizing. And that usually just is not going to happen, especially if your opponent's range is mostly kings or garbage. Because remember, the opponent bet the flop and bet the turn, so the opponent probably has something. If the opponent has a busted heart draw, he's obviously going to fold. If he has a set, he's obviously going to call. If he has a king, I would think he's obviously going to call. Maybe not, though. May make a nitty fold. The problem is, what bluffs could Ape Styles have? There really aren't a ton, right? When there aren't a ton of bluffs, you should at least consider making the fold. I think that's probably a little bit nitty, given I know Ape Styles is on the loose and aggressive side, but works out. All right, European's disconnected. Let's fast forward. There we go. It's never good to get disconnected at a final table. Make sure you have good backup internet. Now you can buy a mobile device that will give you internet. So that is relevant. If you are an American and you happen to go to Canada to play, make sure your internet is based in Canada or elsewhere, because otherwise it'll think you're in America and it will not let you play. So make sure you have that taken care of. Sirens outside. I'm luckbox bets here. I think that's perfectly fine. As the in-position player, you get to bet a lot on those big monotone boards because you have a lot of aces and kings of hearts, ace and king of hearts, plus just good made hands. So you certainly should be betting there a decent amount. Raise from pocket tens. 9-8 offsuit should probably defend. You don't love it, but it's definitely a good enough hand to defend. Luckbox can also bet small here if he feels like it, or just check. The problem with checking is that you let your opponent realize equity. So usually a small bet's just going to be better, because then you're putting money in against the bad spades, and if they happen to fold, then that's fine too. So I like a small bet there. Notice again, a lot of small betting going on. A lot of people get in their minds they have to bet big because they want their opponents to fold, but that is just not true. It's hard to play from out of position, which is often the case when you raise and then someone defends. Notice 10-3 suited folds. I think that's perfectly fine. Obviously 10-3 wished it did not fold this time. But multi-way, again, even being suited, it's just not a good enough spot to stick around. So you need to get out of the way. So from out of position, Luckbox is in a pretty rough spot on this board because you have to assume ape style should have a lot of big card type hands. So I think it's fine just to check, looking to check fold. Obviously, you could have the best hand if he has King Jack or something like that. You do have backdoor hearts, but this board is just way too good for the flatter. And then notice Ape Styles bet the flop, as he definitely should. Obviously, he protects his equity by betting, but sometimes when he gets called, he's in bad shape, but that's fine. Betting small and protecting your equity is usually quite a decent result. So I imagine Luckbox is either going to raise or limp. I typically limp in these scenarios, but raising to 4 big blinds is also fine. Luckbox does limp. And this is definitely a clear marginal made hand. The question is, should we just bet to clean up equity? And betting small can never be that bad in spots like this, because if your opponent folds anything, whatever it is has equity, right? Like right here, the opponent had an 8, which, it's 3 outs. 3 outs count, and you might as well not let the 3 outs win. And also, whenever you bet, you make all those junky hands not have the potential to bluff, right? Whereas if you check and they bet and you call, and then on the turn you check and they bet again, now all of a sudden you're in a pretty miserable spot. 10-7 suited should definitely defend. You may opt to shove all in. Again, if you think your opponent's going to raise too often on the button and then fold too often to a jam, then shoving is very, very strong. But we are playing against very good players, right? Which is why you don't see that happening as often online as you probably should see it happening live. Because in live poker, quite often people raise literally any 2 cards on the button, and then they just can't defend anywhere near properly. I think that's probably a spot where the 10-7 suited should consider calling with the backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, and 2 middle cards. Obviously, he was nearly dead that time, but it's a spot where I do think Luckbox is going to be betting very, very frequently. So here I have a raise and a call from in position with ace-2 suited. I mentioned that a lot of the best players are doing a lot of flat calling in position. There's a program called Munker Solver, which is, funny enough, it's this avatar here. The Munker Solver suggests a lot of calling from the button. Let's see if I can rewind this just a second. Notice here Ape Styles leads this flop, which is kind of interesting. The hands that the button should be flatting are very often going to be good big cards and big suited connected type hands. And those kind of line up well with this. Luckbox should obviously have a regular opening range. So in this scenario, I'm kind of surprised Ape Styles didn't check call, but leading does have some merit, especially if you think they're going to respond very straightforwardly. Because when you bet and they fold out hands with equity, right? Like right here, Luckbox has a solid 6 outs. And sometimes what will happen is Ape Styles will check call the flop, and then the opponent will bet the turn, he'll check call again, and on the river he'll have to check and then either make a huge call or fold. So it's kind of an interesting scenario. I'm surprised with the lead. I definitely would not have led here. I would have certainly just taken the check call path. Let's see how much he bet. He did go small, so that makes sense, right? If you bet huge, then you run the risk of mostly getting called when you're in bad shape, and you certainly don't want to have that happen. Interesting lead, though. I don't think I would have done that. I get the idea of protecting equity and not facing horrible river scenarios, right? But if you bet and get called, you're going to often face horrible river scenarios. All right, notice unblock box just flats to tens. You don't want to 3-bet because if you 3-bet and get called or re-raise, you're just dead. Not dead. You're in bad shape, right? Because you're going to be against aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king when you get re-raised. So, kind of surprised to see Lena check the turn. You're certainly not worried about fours. Actually, let me rewind. I'm not entirely sure how the flop action went. Sorry, I got busy talking. All right, on the flop, Lena checks, and then unblock box checks, right? So I'm kind of surprised that Lena doesn't just bet the turn here for value. I mean, you're certainly not worried about being beat, so why would you not want to get money in the pot against hands like pocket tens that will call a bet now? Maybe he presumes hands like pocket tens will fold to a bet and just thinks there's no way to get money in the pot. Certainly reasonable, right? The thing is, when you have the two aces, you block a lot of what your opponent can have. And it's hard to get money in the pot. One thing you'll also find, by the way, is usually turn and river bets are much bigger than flop bets. And that's because usually when you're betting the turn or the river, especially in final table scenarios, you're going to be very polarized. Meaning you have either a really good hand or garbage. When you have a really good hand, you want to get a lot of money in the pot. When you have garbage, you don't care if you have fold equity, right? So usually you're going to see more of big bets being used on the turn and river. Also, once your opponent does check call a flop bet, I know that's not what happened then, but once your opponent does check call a flop bet, it means they just lost a lot of the garbage out of their range. So that means when you are continuing to bet, you should be betting bigger because your range should be more polarized because range versus range equity is running closer together after your opponent folds out a lot of their garbage by check calling the flop, right? Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. I hope you're enjoying the Thanksgiving Day Marathon. And let me tell you really quick about one of my favorite courses that I've ever made. It is Master High Roller Final Tables, where I review 3 final table high rollers, and I provide in-depth feedback on the strategy that the players use. And some of the players that I cover are Ape Styles, who posted a graph where he's up about $2 million last month. Hello Toddy, Dominic Niche, Adrian Mateos, who just won the $250,000, no, what did he win? He won the Party Poker $10,000 buy-in tournament and took like 3rd place or something in the in another one of the high rollers, so he's crushing it. Nick Petrangelo and many other top pros. I actually made this series to help one of my students, David Einhorn, prepare for the $1 million buy-in tournament at the World Series of Poker, where he did amazingly well. He ended up busting in, I think it was 6th place or 5th place, something like that. And I was very proud of the work that he put in, and I always enjoy watching my students' skills improve. And what we did is we reviewed the plays that the best players were making to find things that we could take advantage of, and also to just realize that against a lot of these players, your best option is to just play a really strong, fundamentally sound strategy to the point that they can't do much about you. So anyway, check out this course, Master High Rollers Final Tables. It is eye-opening, and I always love learning from the best players in the world. You can actually get this course and many, 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 many more completely free when you have access to pokercoaching.com/ or Poker Coaching Premium. There we go. It's like a tongue twister. Check out pokercoaching.com/ Black Friday for the cheapest price you are ever going to be able to get Poker Coaching Premium for right now. You will not be disappointed, and I am very confident you will learn a ton and take your poker skills to the next level.